What's the most messed up family secret you're aware of? Story 1. My great-aunt vanished without a trace one day, leaving the family utterly confused. This occurred in the 1940s or 50s near Portland when she was in her mid-20s. She was known for her cheerful and bright personality and had a strong bond with her family. One day, however, she simply didn't return home from work, with no clues or explanation. Her disappearance led the family to assume she had either been kidnapped or tragically died somewhere, her whereabouts never to be discovered. Fast forward 5 years. Her brother was on a business trip in Chicago. Walking out of his office one day, he saw a woman on the street who looked exactly like her. In disbelief, he called out her name. To his shock, she turned around, startled. She acknowledged him but was clearly reluctant to engage. After some hesitation, she invited him to her apartment, promising to explain everything once there. As he began asking questions, she excused herself, saying she needed cigarettes from the shop. Across the street to process everything, against his better judgment, he let her go alone. She never returned. To this day, no one knows what happened to her. Story 2. Coming from a highly dysfunctional family, I could share many unsettling secrets. Here are a few for you to judge. My Uncle Jeff, under the influence of drugs, killed his best friend, thanks to my grandfather, who was the local police chief. Jeff faced only minimal consequences. Jeff also engaged in exploitative behavior toward his daughters, which he did for financial gain. His wife eventually divorced him and took the girls. However, years later, both daughters became pregnant by their stepfather, who, ironically, was a preacher. My grandfather died from a serious illness, but the family told everyone it was cancer to protect his reputation. To this day, I don't know how he actually got sick, as no one talks about it. This same grandfather would spread false rumors about my mom, claiming she was having affairs. His actions caused major issues in her marriage, yet he didn't stop, even when it created immense pain for her. My grandmother once hired men to intimidate a woman she disliked, simply to prevent her from marrying my uncle. My sister ran away from home and endured something traumatic during that time. Instead of supporting her, the family blamed her, calling her rebellious. They even used to joke about it. Although the subject is now avoided altogether. Story 3. When I was a child, around 10 years old, our small 3-family house in East Boston was broken into. The thief stole several items, the most notable being my grandmother's cherished jewelry from Italy. I vividly remember my Italian grandfather calmly speaking to the police, declining their assistance after their initial investigation. Once the police left, my grandfather made a few phone calls. Not long after, the phone rang, and he had a brief conversation in Italian. He then kissed my grandmother and left the house. Before walking out, he uttered a phrase I'd never heard before. Curious, I mimicked the heavily accented words, which sounded like blow callop pour. My grandmother later explained it meant, lock the door. Years later, I learned the full story. A friend of my grandfather's called to inform him that 2 men were trying to sell my grandmother's stolen jewelry at a nearby Italian CAF. My grandfather spoke to them over the phone, saying, Blair la ora, or lock the door. Roughly 15 minutes later, he returned home with all the stolen items. What transpired in that short time remains a mystery. Story 4. My uncle and aunt are actually my adoptive parents, and my biological father's story is a tragic one. After returning from Vietnam in 1969, my father was deeply affected by his experiences. While I don't know exactly what he endured, it clearly left scars. He struggled with heroin and alcohol addiction, and during this period, he met my mother. Their relationship was tumultuous from the start, worsened by their substance abuse. Shortly after getting married, my mother became pregnant with me. Unfortunately, their volatile relationship reached its breaking point when I was about 10 months old. During an argument in the garage, my father violently threw me to the floor, causing severe injuries. My mother fought back, hitting him with an object, but he retaliated with a weapon, injuring both her and himself. I nearly lost my life that day and spent the following year in the hospital. Although doctors feared lasting effects, I recovered better than expected, though I still experience occasional headaches. Thankfully, my uncle and aunt adopted me, providing the loving home I needed. I consider them my true parents. Story 5. When I was 21, just a few years ago, my eldest sister confided in me about a traumatic event she had endured at 17. She revealed she had been assaulted by a stranger, a secret that had been kept from the entire family. The revelation shocked me, especially since no one in our large family had ever mentioned it. My sister, who is 17 years older than me, and I share a striking resemblance. For a school project, I once asked my mom detailed questions about my birth, but to my surprise, she couldn't recall much about it. As I got older, I started questioning certain details about my birth. My mother, who is deeply religious and firmly opposed to abortion, struggled to recall basic facts. Who was in the delivery room, the exact time I was born, even small details most parents remember. It struck me as odd, but I didn't dwell on it too much. Then, when I was 21, my oldest sister confided in me about something traumatic. When she was 17, she had been assaulted by a stranger. No one in our large family had ever spoken about it before, and hearing it shocked me. Over time, I began to suspect something unsettling, that I might actually be her daughter, conceived as a result of that terrible event, and that my grandparents had chosen to raise me as their own to protect her. It wouldn't be out of character for them, given the circumstances. Still, I've never asked my sister directly. Part of me thinks if this were true, she would have mentioned it when she told me her story. Another part of me fears that bringing it up could hurt her deeply, turning an already painful experience into something about me. So for now, it remains just a strange, lingering theory. Story 6. I suppose my childhood is my family's open secret, the one everyone knows but no one talks about. Officially, my grandmother is my mom, but in reality, I was adopted. My biological mother married a man who abused me when I was very young. This went on until I was about 5 or 6. Eventually, I confided in a friend who told their parents, who then reported it to the school. Instead of protecting me, my mother chose to defend her husband, the father of her 2 other children. She outright denied my claims to the police, and even went as far as taking out a restraining order against me, ensuring I wouldn't return until I turned 18. Thankfully, my grandmother stepped in and adopted me. We moved across the state for a fresh start, but school was difficult. I remember getting in trouble once, and when the staff asked who to call, I told them to contact my grandmother. When they checked my file, only my mother's name was listed. That led to an uncomfortable conversation with the vice principal about why I didn't just call her mom. It's not something you explain to people easily, you know? You just live with it. Story 7. There's a long-standing rumor in my family that my great-grandmother, Gigi, was a black widow. She had 4 husbands, and all 4 died under mysterious circumstances. One of them was stabbed to death by Gigi's brother. The official story is that the husband attacked Gigi, and her brother stepped in to protect her. No charges were ever filed, but the whispers in the family suggest there was more to it. My grandmother, Gigi's daughter, cut off all contact with her mother when she was just 18, back in 1950. Gigi lived until 2014, passing away at 96, meaning they didn't speak for over 6 decades. Whatever happened between them must have been serious. Some believe my grandmother suspected that her father was one of Gigi's victims. I was close to Gigi in the last 10 years of her life. She was sweet, the kind of grandma who always had a warm smile and fresh cookies. But sometimes, when she was angry, she had this look, an unsettling, cold stare. It made me wonder if the rumors were true. Story 8. I recently lost a cousin who had struggled with homelessness, addiction, and alcoholism. Toward the end of his life, he became fixated on one question: what happened to his father? His dad had been abusive, so violent that, when my cousin was only 2 years old, my aunt took her 4 children and left, never looking back. None of them had heard from or about their father in over 40 years. My cousin wanted answers, but his 3 surviving siblings had no interest in digging up the past. Out of curiosity, I did some searching and found out their father had died about a decade ago. What shocked me was that he had started a second family, one that my cousins knew nothing about. This new family was well off, living in comfort, while my cousins had struggled their entire lives. To make matters even stranger, one of his daughters from the second family lives in our community. From her social media, I discovered that she attends the same church as one of my surviving cousins. It's possible they know each other. Completely unaware they're half-siblings, I haven't told my cousins. Unless I see a situation where their children might unknowingly start dating, I don't plan to. Some secrets are best left buried. Story 9. This isn't a confirmed family secret, but there's a strong suspicion that my grandfather may have been involved in something serious. He was a violent man with a quick temper, known for abusing his wives and children. My mom still has scars, both physical and emotional, from his actions decades ago. At some point, he had a major conflict with someone, possibly a local cop or someone from the community. Weeks later, that person was found dead near train tracks under unclear circumstances. Years later, in a moment of unsettling honesty, my grandfather told my mom, "If you ever have problems with someone, I know how to handle it." She never asked what he meant, but she had a feeling he wasn't exaggerating. He also showed disturbing behavior in other ways. He was cruel to animals, aggressive toward neighbors, and carried an eerie sense of control over the people around him. Whether or not he actually committed a crime, the possibility alone is enough to haunt me. Story 10. My grandfather has a son from another woman, one that no one in my mom's side of the family talks about. The woman named her son after my grandfather, meaning I technically have two Uncle Roberts. My mom let the secret slip when I was in high school. She mentioned that Uncle Robert had just been released from jail and was trying to contact my grandpa. That's when I realized she wasn't talking about the uncle I knew. I don't think many of my cousins even know he exists, except maybe my uncle's children. My grandfather and my known uncle have a strained relationship, so it wouldn't surprise me if my uncle told his kids about this long-lost half-brother just to turn them against our grandpa. Despite all the family drama, we cousins love our grandpa. He and my grandma have been married for over 60 years. I have no idea how she dealt with everything back then, but she did. That alone is incredible. Story 11. My mom always claimed she was arrested because of my dad. He was a heavy smoker, and my mom always claimed she was arrested because of my dad. He smoked a lot of marijuana and apparently stored some in her car, which got her into trouble while both of them were in jail. My brother and I lived with my dad's adoptive parents for 5 years. Since I was with my grandparents from infancy until I was about 5, I never really questioned who my real parents were. I just assumed my grandparents were my parents. Recently, they returned some of my childhood belongings, including court documents. That's when I learned the real reason we were taken from my mother. It wasn't just because of my dad's drugs. The reports described our home as borderline unsanitary, with marijuana stored in the fridge but barely any food. My brother and I both had numerous bruises. I had a broken rib. My brother had a fractured skull and needed treatment. Despite all this, my mother was given opportunities to visit us in a neutral location. She rarely showed up. When she was finally granted supervised visits, she would just drive around aimlessly for hours instead of spending time with us, for reasons I still don't understand. We were eventually returned to her custody. She had a new boyfriend by then, but he was no better. He mistreated us too. My brother has muscular dystrophy, but she treated him like a helpless child, never acknowledging that he was growing up. He believes everything she says and resents our grandparents, convinced they hated him. She told him that, in reality, they were the only ones trying to make sure he got proper care, speech therapy, close monitoring at school, anything to help him. My mom will never admit the truth. She's built her whole life around being the brave single mom who did her best. It's classic narcissistic behavior. Story 12. My mother and I are fairly convinced that my grandfather may have fathered a child while stationed in Europe during World War II. He rarely spoke about his time in the war, but we knew he had a serious relationship overseas. He and this woman were supposedly very much in love, and he had every intention of bringing her to the U.S. when he returned, but for some reason, he never did. We always assumed it was just one of those wartime romances that didn't survive reality. After he passed away, we sorted through his belongings and found a photograph. It was of his girlfriend, smiling, her hand resting on what looked like a very noticeable baby bump. He had written a note on the back confirming she was his girlfriend, but there was no mention of a child. We're not 100% sure, but it seems likely she was pregnant when the photo was taken. That raises a lot of questions. Why didn't he bring her over? Did she ever try to contact him? Do I have unknown cousins somewhere in Europe right now? I doubt we'll ever get answers, but it's a strange thing to wonder about. Story 13. When I was a kid, we had to spread salt all over our floors at night. If we didn't, we'd wake up to find the entire floor covered in slugs. Not just a few, dozens, maybe hundreds, enough to make it look like we had a moving, slimy black carpet. At first, I was horrified, but then I learned that the slugs were actually useful. According to my grandmother, their mucus had healing properties. You could squeeze them for relief from dry eyes or rub their secretions on cuts and scrapes to speed up healing. It even worked wonders for diaper rash. She'd put a few slugs in a baby's diaper and somehow it helped. We thought the slugs were getting into the house through the bathtub faucet, but eventually, we discovered the truth. My eccentric grandmother was stealing them from a neighbor's slug farm. In 1997, she accidentally caused a slug shortage in North Houston because of it. Story 14. I know a pretty messed up secret about my friend's family. His mother was involved in the adult film industry in the 70s and 80s before leaving that life behind and marrying his father. That's not the secret, though. The real issue started when the internet became more accessible in the mid-90s. Like most teenagers, my friend started exploring the internet. But this story doesn't go in the direction you'd expect. He didn't accidentally stumble across images of his mother. Instead, after hearing rumors from his dad, he intentionally searched for them. He told me all of this years later. At first, he was just curious to see if the rumors were true, but when he found the images, he realized he was attracted to them, and he acted on those feelings. I was stunned when he admitted this to me. It completely changed how I saw him for a while. He even showed me one of her old films, grainy and definitely from another era. From a teenage perspective, it was more exposure than we were used to back then. Surprisingly, I could understand why he felt that way, even if it was incredibly bizarre. Story 15. My grandfather had an affair around the time I was born, and the result was a child, a half-uncle I've never met. This has been a family secret for decades. I'm 29 now, and as far as I know, only my grandmother, my oldest uncle, and I are aware of it. I found out by accident. I was living with my grandparents for a while, helping them out when my grandfather asked me to assist him with setting up online banking. He wanted to arrange automatic payments, which I assumed were just for bills. While I was helping him, he casually mentioned that one of the payments was going to Julia. I thought he meant a company, so I asked what the payment was for. His response? To get back at your Nana. That's when he told me everything. My grandmother had cheated on him first, so he sought revenge by having an affair, but he didn't just cheat. He had a son, my half-uncle. I tried to get more information from my grandfather and my uncle, but neither of them would say much more. I only know that my half-uncle is my age. I've never met him, but part of me wants to. Story 16. When my aunt was a teenager, she had a baby. My uncle, her older brother, helped her deliver it at home. Everything seemed fine at first. The baby was breathing, crying, healthy. My uncle stepped out of the room for a moment to find something to cut the umbilical cord, but when he returned, the baby was silent. Panicked, he rushed over and found that the baby was no longer breathing. He asked my aunt what had happened, and she just shrugged. It stopped crying, she said. Later, she admitted the truth. She had smothered it. She was only 15 at the time. My mother was 8 or 9 years old when it happened, and at the time, she didn't fully understand what had taken place. It wasn't until years later that she pieced everything together. Talking to my uncle years later, I learned more about what happened. According to my mother, when my grandfather found out, he was absolutely furious. He nearly beat my aunt, but instead, he stormed outside and buried the child in the backyard. My grandfather was a World War II veteran who had seen and endured a lot, but my mom said she had never seen him cry the way he did while digging that grave. Apparently, this wasn't the only time my aunt had been pregnant as a teenager. One baby was stillborn, and another didn't survive for different reasons. My aunt has since passed away, and to be honest, she wasn't well liked. Most people considered her a cruel person. Ironically, she became a Methodist preacher later in life. Story 17. Growing up, there was this woman who would occasionally show up at family gatherings. She was known as the problem child of an old family friend who had passed away. She often came around asking for money or a place to stay, but most of the family shunned her. They claimed she had fallen into a bad lifestyle, drugs, instability, and other problems. So she wasn't welcome. As I got older, I started talking to her more. I felt like I could relate to her in some way. That's when she told me the truth. She was actually my sister. It turned out my extremely religious mother had her as a teenager. And my grandparents did everything they could to hide it. They went to great lengths to cover up the pregnancy, keeping it a secret from the community. Learning this was one of the many reasons I eventually left my hometown. It solidified my deep resentment for religious communities that prioritize their reputation over their own family. Story 18. Recently, my parents shared some disturbing details about what my grandfather did to my grandmother back in the late 1930s. I always knew my mother had an older sister who was stillborn, but I never understood why. Now, I do. My grandfather didn't want the baby, so when my grandmother went into labor, instead of getting a doctor like he had promised, he disappeared. She was left to give birth alone, miles from any help. This was during a time when home births were common, and phones weren't available in rural areas. He returned over 24 hours later with the doctor, but by then it was too late. The baby had passed, and my grandmother was barely clinging to life. Despite this, they stayed together. I have no idea why. When my mother was born years later, my grandmother wasn't about to risk the same thing happening again. She made sure she stayed close to help, even walking herself to the doctor's office to make sure she wouldn't be left alone. There's one more mystery surrounding my grandfather. Before he died, he shared a secret with my father, something he did during World War II. My father refuses to tell anyone, saying, "You wouldn't be able to handle it." Considering my father has always been open about his own experiences in Vietnam, I can't imagine what my grandfather's secret must be. But it must be something truly disturbing. Story 19. My cousin struggled with heroin addiction while living at home with her parents. When they discovered her addiction, they sent her to a treatment center. But they didn't do much research beforehand. They just assumed it was legitimate. After dropping her off, the so-called treatment group took her to a big city and immediately started trying to convert her to some strange belief system. They had her hold an electrode in each hand and pressured her to confess her wrongdoings. Then, out of nowhere, they demanded $500. For what? No one really knows. Eventually, my cousin called her parents, furious. She told them they had unknowingly sent her to some kind of cult. Her parents were completely shocked. They had no idea. They drove out immediately to get her and bring her home. Story 20. I was taking care of my grandfather's house after his failed attempt to harm himself. When he came back from the hospital, I stayed with him for a few days to help out before heading home. As I was about to leave, I went to give him a hug. Suddenly, he grabbed me inappropriately. I was completely shocked. I pushed him away and immediately told him, "You can't do that." His response? "We're not biologically related." That statement disturbed me on so many levels. This man had been my grandfather all my life, and now he was using some technicality to justify his behavior. I told my father about what happened, but he dismissed it, saying my grandfather wasn't mentally well and was probably delusional. I tried to let it go and continued helping my grandfather, running errands, picking up groceries, refilling his medications. Then, about a week later, it happened again. I was washing dishes when he touched me inappropriately once more. This time, I reacted instinctively. I smacked him with a spatula I was holding hard. He lost his balance and fell. I helped him to his recliner, but after that, I left. Neither of us spoke about it again, and I haven't been back since. Story 21. When I was very young, my grandfather on my mother's side was supposedly battling leukemia. I remember my mother flying to Iowa a few times to visit him. Eventually, he passed away. I always assumed it was from the illness. Fast forward about 18 years. One day, my brother suddenly asks me, "How do you think Grandpa died?" I responded without thinking, "Leukemia." He shook his head. That's what I thought too. But according to our older brother, he took his own life. Apparently, our mother never wanted us to know the truth. According to my older brother, our grandfather had been deeply depressed. In the end, it wasn't the cancer that killed him. It was something else entirely. He took his own life with a gun. It was because of his depression that my mom initially flew to Iowa, out of concern for his mental state. She must have known things were worse than she let on. I don't have the courage to ask my mom directly. I don't want to make her relive that painful memory, whether it's true or not. I'm afraid of bringing up such a sensitive topic and causing her more pain. I've tried searching Iowa death records since I know the county he lived in, but I haven't found anything conclusive. I want to know the truth. But I doubt I'll ever be able to ask my mom about it. Story 22, there's a strange joke my uncles only tell after they've had a few drinks. It always involves a sound. Part of the joke itself, a long, raspy noise, like someone clearing their throat. Sharuk, every family gathering follows the same pattern. After the day's events wind down, the aunts wash dishes, the cousins play, and the uncles gather outside. They lean back in their chairs, drinking and laughing under the trees. Then, one uncle makes the sound, Sharuk. Even in the darkness, you can picture him making a gesture, a slow, sideways movement across his neck. The aunts shake their heads, muttering. Men, the younger cousins mimic the noise, running around and laughing. The uncles lean in, teaching them how to do it properly. It's become a sort of family tradition, passed down from one generation to the next. Whenever we asked about its meaning, the uncles would always say, "We'll tell you when you're older." They kept it mysterious. A secret story meant only for adults. The summer I turned 18, I finally heard the full story. My uncle told me it came from the war. When they had all served in the same regiment, they were captured and sent to a labor camp, forced to work under brutal conditions. Every day, they lived in fear under the watchful eye of a ruthless officer. This officer had a horrifying routine. If he found a woman he desired, he would force her into a humiliating situation before taking her life. And when he did it, the sound Sharuk would be heard. But one day, as he was attempting this again, he made a mistake. One that cost him his own life. The uncles always saw that moment as a symbol of survival, an unexpected turn of fate that somehow led to their escape from that nightmare. Now, Sharuk has become our family's secret code for hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something unexpected might save you. Story 23, when I was 17, my father broke down and shared a difficult truth with me. He had another child, born 16 months before me, with a woman who wasn't my mother. It happened during a brief separation between my parents, and the entire family knew about it. Except me. My half-brother was raised entirely by his mother, and my father didn't meet him until he was 13 years old. Meanwhile, my dad lived a seemingly normal life with my mom and me. Even my mom was aware of his existence. My parents had made an agreement. As long as my dad had no involvement with his other child, their marriage could continue. Whenever we visited my grandparents, they would hide photos of my half-brother to keep me from finding out. It was a family-wide secret. I've always felt some guilt, knowing I was the child my father chose to raise. But thankfully, my half-brother and I have formed a close relationship, and over the past few years, my father has been making an effort to build a bond with him too. Story 24, I have a great uncle who is, frankly, a terrible person. He's a preacher for some church, though I'm not even sure what denomination it is, or if it follows any real religious doctrine at all. He's the biggest hypocrite I know. He acts self-righteous, constantly condemning other religions, but won't let anyone into his church unless they're donating money. Most of my family is Roman Catholic, and he once told one of my aunts that she, along with the rest of us, was doomed for following such a heathen religion. He even claimed he would be up in the castle, higher in heaven than everyone else, regardless of someone's beliefs. That's just wrong. But that's not even the worst of it. When my grandfather, his own brother-in-law, asked him to pray before undergoing surgery for an aneurysm, he mocked him. You'd think a preacher would offer comfort, but apparently not. And then there's his past. My great-uncle used to sell drugs, serious drugs, crack, heroin, and he didn't just deal them. He made his own nieces and nephews deliver them. To make it even worse, he molested at least 2 of my aunts when they were young. They only came forward recently because they had felt guilty for so long. His son also assaulted one of my aunts. Despite all of this, my family continued to interact with him for years, just to avoid causing a rift. Many of them knew about the drug dealing. Even if they weren't aware, he was using kids to transport them. The real breaking point came when he started bad-mouthing my grandparents about their religion. That was when my grandparents finally cut ties with him. It was long overdue. Even as a kid, He always gave me the creeps. Story 25. About 3 years ago, my mother tried to harm my daughter by depriving her of water. We were at a family picnic. My mother gave my son food and water when he asked, but when my nonverbal 2-year-old daughter reached for some, she got nothing. It took us a while to realize what was happening. In the end, it was actually my 5-year-old son who pointed it out. I couldn't imagine telling a toddler, "No, you can't have water." When I confronted my mother, she looked me in the eye and said my daughter didn't deserve it because she wasn't the firstborn. I was absolutely furious, ready to physically confront her, but my dad stepped in and defended her. By the time we realized what was happening, my daughter was already so dehydrated that we had to force fluids into her. She ended up in the hospital, needing N4. A hospital visit is traumatic for any child, but for a 2-year-old, it was heartbreaking. We've only spoken to my parents twice since. Both times at my grandparents' funerals, they haven't seen either of my children since that day. Once, my mother tried to visit our home. I told her that if she ever tried to contact my kids again, I would call the police, and if necessary, I would defend my family. It may sound dramatic, but I mean it. My kids will decide for themselves how they feel about their grandparents when they're old enough. Until then, it's my responsibility to protect them. My grandmother managed to figure out where he lived from the limited information he had given her. So, she took a train to confront him. This was in the 1940s when she arrived. His sisters met her at the door. They explained that he was already married, with children. Then, without hesitation, they handed her about $800, an enormous amount at the time, suggesting she take care of it. Get an abortion. My grandmother was devastated. Instead, she decided to use the money to return to Chicago and start a new life, for herself and for my mother. So, the big secret in our family? It's simply that my mother exists. A few years ago, I had a cancer scare and signed up for a genetic testing website. Someone reached out claiming to be my third cousin, but they didn't know exactly how we were related. After comparing names, we realized we were connected through my mother's biological father. That's how we finally figured out his identity. About 5 years ago, he had since passed away, but in life, he had been a prominent figure in his state. He served as the state's attorney general for over 20 years, well-known, respected, a man with a reputation to uphold. If it had ever come out that he had an illegitimate child, it probably would have ruined his career. Story 27. My aunt passed away a little over a year ago. My dad's side of the family is large. He has or had 7 siblings, so there were plenty of cousins and extended relatives at the funeral. During the service, I was having a relatively serious conversation with one of my cousins when a man, likely in his 50s, approached me and started talking. He gave off an incredibly creepy vibe. I responded briefly, trying to be polite but hoping to get away from him as quickly as possible. That's when I noticed something strange. My grandmother was completely ignoring him, not just avoiding eye contact, outright pretending he wasn't there. Whenever he tried to engage with her, she acted as if he didn't exist. A few days later, I overheard my dad talking to the cousin I had been speaking to at the funeral. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation, and what I heard stunned me. That man? The one my grandmother refused to acknowledge? He's actually her son. My grandmother had an affair with my deceased aunt's husband while my grandfather was in jail. The result of that affair was the man at the funeral, but my grandmother refuses to acknowledge that it ever happened. She gave him up for adoption and, to this day, won't even look at him. Story 28. One of the most tragic events in my family's history happened when my mother was young. She had been visiting her 3 cousins at their home. Their mother, her aunt, was dying of cancer, and the house was filled with grief. That night, her cousins invited her to stay over. She wanted to, but fortunately, my grandmother decided against it. They had dinner, and then my mom went home. That decision saved her life. I don't know if it was the stress of his wife's illness or something deeper, but my mother's uncle decided that the entire family needed to join her in heaven. In the middle of the night, he took a gun and shot his 2 youngest children while they slept. His oldest daughter woke up at the sound of the gunfire. Realizing what was happening, she climbed out the window and ran to the neighbor's house. The neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, my mother's uncle attempted to take his own life, but the gun jammed. He was arrested and sent to a psychiatric facility after the incident. I don't know what happened to him after that. Story 29. It turns out my father is not my biological father. I always knew my mother had been married before, but I never asked for details. It wasn't my business, and I wasn't interested in the drama. She had always told me, if you ever want to know the full story, just ask, but I never did. Then, one evening, while visiting my grandmother, uncle, and aunt, the truth slipped out. My grandmother, who is nearly 90, accidentally mentioned that she hated my biological father. She said his full name, and it had the same last name as my dad. At first, I thought she was just confused. Maybe. She misspoke. I asked her to repeat it. She said the same name again. I looked around the room. My uncle seemed puzzled. My dad looked completely unfazed. But my aunt? Her jaw had dropped. That's when she revealed the truth. My biological father is actually my stepfather's brother. So, my mom married 2 brothers. It doesn't change my perception of anyone. It doesn't make me feel any different about the family I grew up with. But it was definitely a shocking revelation. Story 30. My aunt has always stood out in our family. She has a darker complexion, jet black hair, and a much thinner frame than her siblings. When they were kids, they used to joke that she had been adopted or found somewhere. The usual cruel comments kids make. Whenever anyone asked about it, the adults would always say she resembled a distant relative. Then, when she was around 40, my grandfather reconnected with the family after spending a few years in Florida. That's when the truth came out. My grandparents were once swingers, and my aunt? She was the result of my grandmother's affair with another man. That revelation also explained why my grandparents eventually separated. But there was more. My grandfather had an affair, too, with his brother's wife. It led to a major fallout. It's the reason my grandfather and his brother don't speak, and why I've never even met my great-uncle. So, the big family secret? My grandfather was wildly unfaithful and may have pressured my grandmother into the lifestyle. Story 30. When I recently started a new job in the climate change department of the local government. It was a great opportunity, but my partner wasn't happy about it, and things quickly started to deteriorate between us. He wasn't employed, so he was supposed to handle taking our son to school. But he often didn't bother. He also refused to help with any cleaning around the house. Our relationship was already strained, and intimacy had become a distant memory. Resentment really isn't a turn-on. One day, after dropping off my son at school, I was running late. I needed to withdraw money and grab a taxi at the bank. I noticed something strange. My period was 3 weeks late. I stopped by a pharmacy to pick up a pregnancy test, fully expecting it to be negative because, well, you need to have sex to get pregnant. To my shock, both tests came back positive. I sat there for an hour, stunned. My partner knocked on the bathroom door, and I asked him how this was even possible. He admitted to having sex with me while I was sleeping and said he had a feeling I would get pregnant from that encounter. I didn't go to work that day. The next day, I explained the situation to my boss, who was understanding, but the pregnancy wasn't easy. I received no support, and after I became single, for obvious reasons, I had to leave my job due to health complications, low blood pressure, leg swelling, and dizziness. Unfortunately, I hadn't been employed long enough to qualify for maternity leave. Despite everything, I tried to put my feelings aside and allowed my ex to have contact with our daughter. She stayed with him and his mother 3 days a week. I assumed she'd be safe there, since his 2 sisters lived with them as well. But I was wrong, and I will never forgive myself for that misjudgment. When my daughter was only 3 months old, my ex harmed her, though he didn't confess until months later. He no longer sees her, and his family has cut off contact with him. As far as I know, he's homeless now. My daughter will never know the full details of how she came into this world or why her father isn't in her life. Story 32. My maternal grandmother had a habit of stealing whatever she could fit into her purse. This is why she rarely came to our house. My mom would always confiscate her bag and coat when she did. It's also why either my mom or dad would return items at restaurants if she had been with us while the rest of us waited in the car. It was later explained that her behavior was likely a result of living through the Great Depression. My mom's brother once partially burned down their home to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War. He succeeded, but later he was committed to a specialized care facility for schizophrenia, perhaps a precursor or consequence of his actions. There's also a strong suspicion that my mom and my aunt suffered from schizophrenia. Though it's impossible to confirm now, my mom was married twice before meeting my father. She was forced to divorce her first husband after they were arrested for smuggling drugs across the border. He went to jail, and she received probation with orders to cut all contact with him. She left her second husband because he was abusive and only kept her around to care for his children. After my mom passed away, we discovered that she had maintained contact with all the children from her second marriage. She had saved their high school and college graduation photos, and one of her stepsons had even joined the military. They had grandchildren who considered her a grandmother, and we found photos among her belongings. We only learned about this months after her funeral. We had no way to contact them, as my mom wasn't tech-savvy and barely used her phone. My mom had also hidden our baby pictures because my siblings and I chose to live with our dad after the divorce. She claimed someone had stolen them during a break-in, but we later found them buried in her closet. Recently, I found out that my aunt is doing something similar, keeping childhood photos of herself, my mom, and my uncle, along with other family history. I'm not sure if these stories count as secrets, but it felt good to share them. Story 33. Growing up, I was never allowed to go into our basement where my grandpa spent most of his time. I was never given a clear reason, just that I wasn't supposed to go down there. I assumed that was normal. Didn't everyone have a basement that was off limits? As I got older, I started noticing people coming and going from the basement late at night, usually older men with heavy accents. One night, I was woken up by loud cheering and shouting coming from the basement. While this was somewhat normal, it was much louder than usual. I got up to investigate and saw at least a dozen men, all over 60, smelling of whiskey and cigars, carrying my grandpa out of the basement. Cheering, I had never seen him look so happy. The next morning, I asked my parents about it over breakfast. They flatly denied hearing anything. When I insisted that I was certain of what I saw, they changed their story, saying Grandpa had some friends from the bowling club over the night before. This continued for a few more years until my grandpa fell ill due to asbestos exposure and eventually passed away after spending his final months in a care home. Later on, I began hearing the basement door quietly opening and closing at night. One day, when I was 14 and homesick from school, I realized that I could finally see what was in the basement, and no one could stop me. The first thing I noticed were 3 very old blackboards, each filled with tables written in chalk. The tables were divided into columns and rows, listing the names of men and their time scores. I recognized some of the names as family members and neighbors. The room was dusty and dark, but it had a bar with stools and an old desk at the end, complete with a computer. That evening, I confronted my father about it. He took me down there, poured himself a drink, and explained everything. Years earlier, my grandpa had watched a news segment on violent video games and became fascinated. He bought a computer and the popular game Duke Nukem, then shared it with his friends, who became just as hooked. They started competing in speedrunning levels for the fastest times, even placing bets. The weekly prizes were usually alcohol. This secret competition continued for years without anyone else in the family knowing. When the rest of the family eventually found out, everyone found it hilarious. Judging by the old records, we discovered that many people had been involved in this secret competition over the years. Some bets reached as high as $1,000, and some of the times were quite impressive. It's not as shocking as some other stories, but it's definitely the most bizarre family secret I know. To this day, my dad and I still play a few levels together over a glass of scotch whenever I visit. Story 34. My mother's first child was given up for adoption because the father left before the baby was born. Later, she had 2 daughters with her first husband, who was a gambling addict. Tragically, he abused the girls for several years. Eventually, my mother either left him or he left her. I'm not sure which. She then met my father and had me and my brother. My father was an alcoholic who left shortly after my younger brother was born. His excuse was that my mom was boring. My mom's explanation was that she had gone to check on him in the bathroom at a bar, only to find him passed out in the urinal. Neither my sister's father nor mine ever paid child support, which likely explains why my mom felt we needed a man in the house. She used a matchmaking service and met the man who would become my stepfather. My stepfather was illiterate and unemployed, though we were never told exactly what was wrong with him. We knew he was off and received injections from a nurse every 2 weeks. He smoked 100 cigarettes a day. I vividly remember watching in horror as he strangled my sister to the point where I thought she was dead. She fell limp and wasn't moving for what felt like forever before finally gasping for air, blood spilling onto the floor. I wanted my mom to call the police, but she insisted on keeping him around for childcare while she worked long hours cleaning houses. She made him promise never to do it again. He later suffered a breakdown and received electroshock therapy, but he returned home, and the fighting resumed. When I turned 18, my mom finally had enough and disappeared, since we lived in government housing and my sisters had already moved out. That left only my stepfather, my brother, and me. We were evicted shortly after, as there weren't enough occupants for a 3-bedroom house. Before we moved out, I found one of my stepfather's medical records, which confirmed he had schizophrenia. This explained a lot. My grandfather, the only decent father figure I had, ended up in the hospital just before we had to move. I intended to visit him, but my stepfather convinced me it was nothing serious. I decided to work my shift that night instead. My grandfather passed away that same night, and my stepfather laughed as he told me. My eldest sister had a child whose father left while she was pregnant. She had become very religious and forgave her own father for his past abuse. When he needed a place to stay, she let him live with her in the house she had inherited from our grandfather. Although I don't believe he harmed her son, he left his lighter on the table, which my nephew used to start a fire that burned down the house. My other sister, the one who was strangled, had 4 children but tragically lost one when she accidentally suffocated the baby by rolling onto it in her sleep. She initially claimed it was SIDS, but later admitted the truth. She struggled with addiction, and we eventually had to remove her other children from her care. Meanwhile, all those years, my mom was cleaning houses. She was paid under the table while also collecting disability benefits, claiming her wrist never healed after an old injury. Story 35. My brother and I have different fathers but the same mother. When we were very young, my brother's dad shot and killed my father and buried him in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He was later sent to prison at San Quentin. Over the years, my mother was vague about the details, but inconsistencies started to emerge. Something drove me to dig into the case. When I became an adult, I reviewed the old high-profile murder case files from the Bay Area. In 1976, the case was connected to heavy drug use and involvement with the Hells Angels. I discovered that my mother had testified against my brother's father to avoid prison time for her own involvement in the incident. I'll never know the full extent of her involvement, as the plea deal allowed her to walk away with a completely redacted testimony. I've never confronted my mother about this, mostly because she wasn't a bad parent in the years that followed. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with what little I do know and to forgive her privately. Story 36. My aunt on my father's side endured an incredibly abusive marriage while living in the UK during the 80s and 90s, a time when there was minimal support for Asian victims of domestic violence. Her husband's abuse was severe, to the point where he beat her until she suffered kidney failure and even burned his son for misbehaving. He would also beat her over trivial matters like the handle on a teacup being on the wrong side or simply for talking to other men. I once witnessed him threatening my aunt, and when I spoke up, he punched me in the stomach. When my mother learned that I had tried to protect my aunt and cousins, she took action. My mother, who is half Scottish and half mixed-race Indian with Tamil and East Asian ancestry, went to their house, rescued my aunt and cousins, and drove them to safety in Manchester. I missed a few days of school due to the injuries from the assault. We later learned that my father's side of the family had known about the abuse but did nothing, fearing the stigma of divorce and Indian culture. Even after my mother's intervention, some family members continued to make excuses for him. My mother called the police, but nothing came of it. The situation escalated to the point where my parents sent me to boarding school to protect me from potential retaliation. Eventually, my aunt's husband left the UK for the USA. Sadly, the impact on my cousins was profound. While the older son became a lawyer, the younger one, spoiled by his father's attempts to buy affection, struggled to find direction in life. This experience taught me a lot about how abuse can manipulate good people into tolerating terrible behavior, and how much has changed over the years in terms of awareness and support. Story 37. My mom grew up in a large family in a rough area of the San Francisco Bay Area. The The family had a notorious reputation within a 100-meter radius, known for criminal activity like carjackings and gang violence. When my mom was around 3, she recalls her older brothers, who were in their 20s, sneaking downstairs and assaulting her. This continued for years until she was 8, when she confided in her 5-year-old brother. Another brother, who wasn't involved, overheard and informed my grandma. One of the perpetrators went to prison, and another later took his own life. What's especially heartbreaking is that my mom often closed her eyes during the attacks, so she couldn't always identify who was harming her. She remembers only 2 of the brothers specifically, especially when one of them committed suicide. My grandmother blamed my mom, saying he would still be alive if she hadn't opened her legs. Despite this horrific past, my mom is one of the strongest women I know. She hasn't shared her story with many people, but I believe she should write a book about her experiences. She's one of the kindest and most loving people I've ever met. She managed to graduate from college, raise a family, and keep her children out of trouble, all while maintaining compassion and love for others. It's remarkable how she turned her life around. Story 38. Friend's parents owned a funeral home and had 2 sons. One son was fathered by an employee, making the boys half-brothers, but the son, born to the owners, never knew this. The owner's son had serious behavioral issues as a child. He set fire to the funeral home, killing his parents and believing he had also killed his half-brother. However, the employee saved his badly burned son from the fire and hid him in a mental institution for many years. Over the next 20 years, the arsonist continued the family business as an undertaker. Mentored by the same employee who had fathered his half-brother, he had no idea of the true relationship between them. The truth came out on national television when the half-brother, now wearing a mask to cover his scars, was revealed to be alive. This discovery sparked a bitter feud between the 2 brothers over the family business. Story 39. There have been some disturbing stories that recently surfaced about the Kennedys. One of the most shocking involves an incident during the birth of one of their daughters. While Mrs. Kennedy was in labor, she was reportedly not allowed to push until the obstetrician arrived, as he needed to be present to receive payment. The nurse was instructed to hold the baby's head in place until the doctor arrived, which took several hours. As a result, the baby suffered from severe oxygen deprivation, leading to developmental delays. The family allegedly concealed this incident to avoid public embarrassment. As the daughter matured, the family became concerned about the possibility of her becoming pregnant. Mr. Kennedy proposed an extreme solution, a lobotomy, to remove her sexual impulses. Without informing the rest of the family, he approved the procedure at a time when doctors were still uncertain about the specifics of lobotomies. The surgeon performed several incisions in her brain, ultimately causing her to lose the ability to speak. The daughter was then sent to an institution, with the family telling others that she had moved to the Midwest to teach and desired privacy. Story 40. My family is quite open about many things. They come from poverty, and reflecting on the past is seen as a way to avoid repeating mistakes. For example, my grandfather often tells the story of a Civil War-era ancestor who killed a man over a pair of boots, forcing him to flee to the plains. This same ancestor once bit off a prostitute's nipple. Ultimately, he went insane and, during a harsh Minnesota winter, pointed a rifle at his daughter-in-law, resulting in his own tragic demise. Was left on the front porch to freeze to death. Stories like these are common in my family, mainly because the people involved have long since passed away. However, it's the stories about living family members that bother me the most. For instance, I grew up with my grandmother trying to protect me from my alcoholic father. Her efforts were so intense that they sometimes defied logic. She did the same for other family members, driven by a strong need to protect and save everyone. I only recently discovered the reason behind her behavior. Her own father was an alcoholic who abused her. Other things are less intense, but still unsettling in ways most people wouldn't understand. For example, during family reunions, certain items are left at home to prevent theft. This is because there are several high-functioning drug addicts in the family, and certain items could be stolen and pawned off. How do you even explain that to people? Given the poverty from which my family comes, there are also quite a few felons among us. Most have served their time and now function well in society. I feel obligated to keep this a secret, which is troubling in its own way. People often treat felons as if they are less than human, and speaking up about it could lead to my ostracization. Story 41. My aunt was in a long-term relationship for most of my life. Likely over 10 years. A few years ago, she and her fiancé broke off their engagement, and my aunt decided to try online dating. She met a man online, and they developed a long-distance relationship. While my aunt had a webcam, the man did not. He would message her while she was on camera, watching her fall asleep. Eventually, she convinced him to talk on the phone, but she was shocked when the voice on the other end was a woman. The woman claimed that her deceased brother's soul was living inside her body and that he was the person my aunt had fallen in love with. Despite this bizarre explanation, my aunt drove from Vermont to Arizona to bring the woman back to live with her and her 3 children. Once the woman moved in, her behavior became increasingly strange. She left bundles of sage outside my cousin's doors to ward off bad spirits, convinced my aunt to sell most of her possessions, and even claimed that spirits had pushed her down the stairs, resulting in a broken arm. At some point, my aunt and the woman entered a civil union. A few months later, the woman attempted to kidnap my aunt's youngest son and take him back to a cult in Arizona. Fortunately, she was caught, and my aunt got her son back. However, the woman had already drained both my aunt's and my grandparents' bank accounts. My aunt eventually had the civil union annulled and has not heard from the woman since. Story 42. In her prime, my grandmother was part of the elite in Chinese society, hosting lavish parties attended by high-ranking nobility and political figures. It was no secret that my mother was not her favorite child, which made sense in that cultural context. My mother had 2 older brothers and a younger sister, so she was neither a son nor the baby of the family. As a result, my grandmother rarely spoke to her and often mistreated her. One day, my grandmother's best friend pulled my mother aside and revealed a secret that my grandmother had never admitted. My mother's father was not my grandmother's first husband, as she had claimed, but rather the son of Chiang Kai-shek, the former leader of the Republic of China, who later became the president of Taiwan. My grandmother never confirmed this story and recently passed away, taking the secret with her. However, the claim is supported by other facts, including the evidence that Chiang Kai-shek was my mother's godfather. There are photos and even a magazine cover of her as a baby sitting on his lap. Story 42. I visited my father in Mexico nearly 10 years after he was deported. This was my first time seeing him in a decade, and he introduced me to many relatives. Within just a couple of blocks, I must have met around 50 family members. My father had built a house there after being deported, and his next-door neighbor was his uncle. I never met this uncle because my father said he despised him, describing him as an unpleasant person. A couple of weeks later, I woke up to find my father in an unusually good mood. It turned out that his uncle had taken his own life in the bathroom. He had suffered from anal cancer or a related condition that made going to the bathroom unbearably painful for years. On my way back to the United States, my paternal grandmother revealed to me that the uncle had abused my father when he was younger. Story 44. Not my story, but a close friend of mine's. He plays the French horn, but he stopped for a few years. He told everyone he was too busy to play. But recently, he told me and a few other friends the real reason. Apparently, his grandmother used to sit in front of him when he played and would make uncomfortable comments about his performance, sometimes in a disturbing way. Over the years, he became so disillusioned by her critical remarks that he just gave up playing altogether. This new revelation left me shocked, as I had no idea how deeply those comments had impacted him. He was only recently able to open up about it, and I think it's been a sort of relief for him. Even if it was hard to admit, the stories you've shared reveal a complex, often painful web of family dynamics. Each narrative, while filled with disturbing moments, also holds valuable insights into how family members navigate trauma, relationships, and the secrets that define them. Let me know if you'd like further expansion or help with additional revisions. When she realized she couldn't follow through with it, I'm glad she didn't, because my aunt is the sweetest, most genuine person I know. There's also a rumor that my maternal grandpa's father performed abortions in the back room of a bar after the war. I don't believe it, but I'd like to ask my grandpa about it. My mom has sworn me to secrecy, though. Story 45, I went to an all-girls private school. We wore kilts. There was one girl there who was quite needy. If you were kind to her, she would latch onto you and be nearly impossible to shake off. I got along with her well enough. But I kept my distance because of that. I did notice, even as a day student, that she never seemed eager to go home. She only went home when the school closed, and she had to, like during Christmas. She was sent to summer camp every year. I didn't think much of it, just found it a little odd, but there were other girls like the foreign students who never went home either. She was from the US, and this school was in Ontario. Boarding students would take buses to the local mall on weekends where they could shop, see movies, etc. Before getting bussed back, one day, she was caught shoplifting during one of these trips and ended up being expelled. I always thought that was unfair, considering that if a day student like me got caught shoplifting over the weekend, we wouldn't have been expelled. At most, our mall privileges would have been revoked. Years passed, and I didn't think about her much until one day when I was chatting with a friend's mom. She used to work at a local mental health facility, and while I'm sure it was a breach of confidentiality, she shared some details with me. The reason the girl rarely went home was that her family didn't want her. When she was very young, too young to be left in charge, her toddler brother had wandered onto the pool cover and drowned. The family blamed her for the accident and kept her at a distance whenever possible. She had seen a local psychologist to deal with guilt and abandonment issues. Understandably, but she was surprisingly well-adjusted. After she was expelled, her family took her back to the US and had her committed. It's shocking what some parents can do.